Hello and welcome to Mr. Valentin's YouTube video for Romeo and Juliet, Act 1. So we're going to get this started. We're going to go over the plot diagram, important literary terms, and then basic plot points of Act 1. Things that will help, of course, is your notebook, a pen, a paper, and any of the V-notes that you downloaded. It's good for referencing or underlining throughout this video. So the first up is the plot diagram. All right, we're going to label this plot diagram. All right, the plot diagram is what makes up a story. In a Shakespeare play, the plot is divided into 6 parts. Each part corresponds with an act. So the first part, Act 1, is what we call the exposition. The exposition is this beginning part right here. And we call it the exposition, and we associate it again with Act 1. This dotted line going up we call the inciting incident. And the inciting incident is associated with the end of Act 1. This line going up is what we call the complication. Some of you may have referred to it as the rising action, which is not altogether wrong, but for our purposes in class, we're going to be calling it the complication. At the very top, we achieve the climax. The complication is associated with Act 2. I could move things correctly. Nope. Alright. And the climax is associated with Act 3. This line going down is what we call the denouement. And we associate the denouement with Act 4. And finally, at the very end of our story, we get to the resolution. And the resolution, of course, is associated with Act 5. And that's your plot diagram. Important literary terms for Act 1. The first is a sonnet. Remember, a sonnet is a 14-line poem with a specific rhyme scheme. Antithesis is what's known as opposition or contrast. We refer to it as the juxtaposition between two ideas. Puns are play on words. A pun might be something where the joke is within the word of the sentence in the given context. So like the butcher said, "It's nice to meet you." A better pun would be, "I wondered why the baseball was getting bigger." Then it hit me. So there we go. A monologue is a long, uninterrupted speech. And we'll be seeing many of these throughout our play. Hyperbole is merely in exaggeration. Foreshadowing is a subtle hint at future events. A soliloquy is a specific type of monologue. It's when the character reveals private thoughts and the character is alone on stage. And of course, we are in the exposition of our story. The exposition is where we meet the characters and the setting. And those are your important literary terms for Act 1. So we begin Act 1, and we're given this prologue from the chorus. I'm not going to reread it, but what I did do on the right-hand side was give you the rhyme scheme. All right. A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. All right, so we have a perfect Shakespearean rhyme scheme. For those who don't remember, all right, the reason why we always begin at the beginning of the alphabet, all right, dignity corresponds with the letter A, all right, so it ends with the sound E, so we label it an A. Then we have the word scene. Now, scene doesn't rhyme with dignity, so we give it the next letter, B. Mutiny rhymes with dignity, so these two words rhyme together, so we label it A. Unclean doesn't rhyme with dignity, but it does rhyme with scene, so we label it B. Foes does not rhyme with dignity or scene, so it's given a new letter, C. All right, so on and so forth. And so that's how we come up with the rhyme scheme. All right, so each of these letters correspond with that. Important things that we find out in the prologue. We find out the location of our story in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. This is a scene that really enjoys its antithetical language. All right. That means we see antithesis at work. We see the juxtaposition between two things. All right. So just for some examples of some of the juxtaposition that we see the word ancient, but we also see the word new. These are two unlike things. They create a juxtaposition. We see the word life, but we also see the word death. And so this too creates juxtaposition. All right. Even things like miss corresponds with mend. And so on and so forth. We could continue labeling all of the juxtaposition, but we could really be here all day if we continue to do it. So it's something you should be aware of. And so what the passage is really saying is it's giving us the entire plot, all right, that there's two households, the Montagues and the Capulets, And they think they're different, but they're not. They're both alike in dignity. And there's been a lot of civil blood. There's been a lot of fighting. And so from the loins of these two foes, the Montagues and the Capulets, a pair of star-crossed lovers come into existence, and they will be Romeo and Juliet. And so what do? They take their life. They kill themselves. Right? Star-crossed means that they're destined to be together. Right? And so we kind of get this set up to the story. We also have, the actors apologizing if they make any mistakes. They say, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage. Our play is going to be about 2 hours. The which, if you with patient ears attend. Right? And they say, what here shall miss. What here we mess up, our toil shall strive to mend. We'll work in the future to try to fix it. If you have your books, this will be helpful. In Act 1, Scene 1, we begin with two characters who are not of extreme importance. We're introduced to Samson and Gregory, and they start the passages by saying lots of puns. And the puns range from good to terrible. They're talking about carrying coals, which means to do menial work. And then they say we should be colliers, people who carry coals or who are dirty. And then they go from coals to collar, which means to be angry. So we see this kind of strange thing. And then they start making some very dirty sexual innuendo about sword fighting. So we see some sexual innuendo that's verges on inappropriate and comedic, of course, in our story. So they're using the swords as play on words. I strike quickly, being moved, but thou art not quickly moved to strike. And Gregory says, to move is to stir, but to be valiant is to stand. So we see all this kind of really erotic and disturbing language. Samson continues, this is around line 14, "'Tis true, and therefore women, being the weaker vessels, are ever thrust to the wall." So they're making advances at women, sexual in nature, and it sounds a little violent. So much so that Samson, around line 23 or thereabouts, says, "I will cut off their heads." And Gregory says, "The heads of the maids?" And Samson says, "Aye, the heads of the maids, or their maiden heads." So he'll either chop off the heads of the maids, quite literally, or their maiden heads, which means their virginity. So we see this language pervade the scene. So Samson and Gregory are in our scene, and they're Capulet serving men. But in comes Abram, who's a Montague. And so the first thing that Samson does is he bites his thumb. Bites his thumb is the equivalent to giving someone the finger. It was considered an extremely rude gesture. And so they talk about this, and we're introduced to a new character, one of our big characters, whose name is Benvolio. And Benvolio's name means goodwill. So I think that's something we should keep in mind throughout our story. And ultimately, the whole thing explodes into a large sword fight. And so I have this picture up here in the corner. I'll blow it up for a second, where you can kind of see all of the sword fighting occurring, the chaos that would exist. Now if I could just... Nope, doesn't want to work. Okay, there we go. Alrighty, let me just move that back. Alrighty. Continuing on. Let me just adjust. We're introduced to Tybalt. Tybalt is part of the Capulet clan. And he'll become an important character throughout our story. He's a very aggressive fellow. And so Capulet or Tybalt and then Benvolio begin to fight. So there's a lot of fighting in the streets. And so citizens start entering, they're screaming, they're yelling. And even Capulet, we're introduced to Mr. Capulet and Mr. Montague. And, they both treat themselves as if they're stronger than they actually are. Capulet says, and this is around line 68, Capulet says, "What noise is this? Give me my long sword." All right, he asks for a sword, and his wife begins to make fun of him. She says, a crutch, why call you for a sword, all right? Why are you asking for a sword, old man? You really just deserve a crutch, she's saying. And Montague says the same, "Thou villain Capulet, hold me not." And he goes to his wife, "Let me not go." So he's kind of doing the, hold me back, hold me back. And Lady Montague is like, "Thou shalt not stir one foot to seek a foe." Like, you're not going anywhere, buddy. So we see these two, Montague and Capulet, try to be stronger than they actually are. So enters the prince, and the prince is a third party. He's not associated with either the Montagues or the Capulets. And he tells them, all right, that this fighting has occurred too long. And around line 90, he says, "If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace." All right, that if they continue this fighting, they will pay consequences, possibly with their lives. All right, so I think that's a really important quote right here. All right, so let's write that down. If ever you, I apologize, syntax, if ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. And I think that's a pretty important quote, all right, because it kind of sets up the story that if the Montagues and Capulets ever fight again, there will be trouble and turmoil. So they kind of split ways, and that's kind of that. And Benvolio starts talking to Mr. Montague, and Benvolio states how Romeo's been acting. He says that he's been underneath the sycamore tree, sick amour, all right, sick love tree. And he goes on to say, "I measure his affections by my own, which then most sought, where most might be found." This is around line 120 and following. "Being one too many by my weary self, pursued my humor, not pursuing his, and gladly shunned, who gladly fled from me." And Montague comments around line 131 that his son is heavy. All right, heavy means like dejected or gloomy. He says his humor is black and portentous. All right, so what's important to remember is during this time they believed in what was known as the four humors. So I'm just going to move this over for just a moment so that we can put the four humors right here. There's four humors, each associated with a bodily function and each associated with a color. All right, so Romeo's humor is black, but we're going to start with yellow. The yellow humor, all right, was associated with urine, and it was associated with a light, mild sickness. We have green, which is associated with phlegm, and associated with throat illnesses. All right, slightly more severe illnesses. Things like the flu, probably. All right, even though that wasn't much of a thing then. All right, then Romeo's humor is black, which is associated with bile, and this is associated with mental illness. And then, of course, there's the red humor. Red is associated with blood, and this is associated with severe illnesses. Not even just severe, I think I should clarify. More like fatal illness. All right, severe would be not enough in this instance. Good. Alright, so we have our 4 humors. So the scene continues, and everyone leaves except for Benvolio and Romeo, and so they talk to each other, and Benvolio wants to find out wrong, and we find out the big problem is that Romeo is in love. He's lovesick. But it turns out he's not lovesick with Juliet. He's lovesick for another Capulet named Rosaline. So he's lovesick about Rosaline. And he says that he can't act anymore, right? That his love is destroying him. And so this kind of pervades. And when Benvolio expresses concern, he's like, you need to cheer up, Romeo. You need to feel better. Romeo's response is, why, such is love's transgression. Grief of my own lie heavy in my breast, which thou wilt propagate to have it pressed with more of thine. All right, that because Benvolio cares about how Romeo feels even worse. All right, so our first impressions of Romeo are kind of this very sad, mopey individual. We also find out, and this is around line 211 and following, that Rosaline hath sworn that she lived chaste, all right, that she's a virgin, and Romeo calls this virginity a waste, all right, that the genes won't pass on, and that she should want to spread her beauty, all right. So that's kind of our first impressions of the story, all right. So this is kind of shocking just in nature that it is so, Romeo is so mopey, and that the love is not about Juliet, but rather about Rosaline. Act 1, Scene 2 begins with Capulet and Paris. All right, we know who Capulet is, but Paris is one of the prince's kinsmen. What kinsman means is a little more vague, though. The kinsman could be like a friend, it could be a cousin, it could be his child. It's a little on the vague side. And so they're talking, and Capulet wants Paris to meet Juliet. And so this kind of forms the scene, all right? Capulet, we find out, is going to throw a party. And so that kind of sets up the scene, all right? Capulet tells Paris that there will be many young people at the feast. So he says, and this is around line 26 and following of Act 1, Scene 2, such comfort as do lusty young men feel when well-apparelled April on the heel of limping winter's trends, even such delight among fresh fennel buds shall you this night inherit at my house. All right, that there'll be many young and beautiful women in this scene. And so they call this serving man, and the serving man is going to hand out the invitations, only the serving man has a problem. So he has to go out and hand out the invitations, and we find out very quickly that he is illiterate, that he doesn't know how to read. And so this becomes a problem because he has to hand out these invitations. So he's walking about and he bumps into Benvolio and Romeo. So I have this picture in the upper hand corner. This is a more modern, updated Romeo and Juliet. And so in this picture, you see Benvolio kind of putting his mouth on Romeo and trying to say, don't talk. All right, stop it. So Romeo reads the letter and finds out that there is going to be this party, and that Rosaline is going to be there. And so Benvolio works to kind of convince him to go, and the serving man, very foolishly, says, and this is line 80 and following, now I'll tell you without asking, my master is the great rich Capulet, And if you not be the house of Montagues, I pray come and crush a cup of wine. Rest you merry. So he invites them to this party, which is both good and a little horrific for him. So, and of course, they plan on going to the party. So, what's interesting, I think, though, is that Romeo is going to the party not to meet Juliet, but to meet with Rosaline. Or at least that's his intentions. Act 1, Scene 3 has some more important characters, Lady Capulet, Nurse, and Juliet. Alright, this is the first we really see of Juliet, and we're introduced to the nurse. And we find out that Juliet is young, 13 years old. She was born on July 31st, hence her name is really, alright, Juliet. Alright, she's born on a time called what's known as Lammastide Eve, which is the day before August 1st. So, the nurse has this long monologue where we find out that she had a daughter who was born around the same time as Juliet, and the daughter's name was Susan. And Susan passed away. And so Juliet very much became the nurse's daughter in many ways. And we find out that this isn't any old nurse. She's what's known as a wet nurse, meaning she breastfed Juliet. And so, in this scene, the nurse makes a lot of dirty, what are known as bawdy jokes, a lot of sexual innuendo, alright, which we see kind of undercurrent throughout the whole story, alright, that she will fall backwards, that it's mandatory for Juliet to start thinking about getting ready to lose her virginity, and Lady Capulet's actually a little disturbed by this. But Lady Capulet, as the scene goes on, we see, isn't very connected to Juliet. That, yes, she's the mother, but she has no real strong connections to her, and she doesn't even really know how to treat her. And Lady Capulet tells Juliet all about Paris. And so at this party, Juliet is going to meet Paris, and Romeo is going to meet Rosaline. Or at least that's the idea. And of course, the nurse cuts the scene by saying, go girl, seek happy nights to happy days. So again, she kind of cuts it with like a dirty, bawdy joke. Act 1, Scene 4 introduces us to Mercutio. Mercutio we might describe as flamboyant, over the top. I have a different interpretation of Romeo and Juliet on the side here, this picture. Alright, and in this picture we kind of see more like clown makeup, more over the top. And this is from the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. And so we see this kind of drunken charade going on, alright, which is very much this scene. It's very much about getting drunk and getting ready to go to the party. Yeah. And Mercutio is just very overt in his flamboyancy. His mask is described as slightly disturbing, with like a long pointed nose and big cheeks, and he talks about being rough with love. This is line 25 and following. Mercutio says, if love be rough with you, be rough with love. Prick love for pricking, and you beat love down. Give me a case to put my visage in. A visor for a visor. So we see this kind of, like, you've got to treat love roughly, which is disturbing all on its own. And then Mercutio kind of goes into his speech about what is known as the Queen Mab. Right? And this is a very famous speech, the Queen Mab speech. And The Queen Mab visits people in their dreams, particularly men. Right? Visits people in their dreams. And their dreams are often, how do we say, of the pleasurable type. All right. Mab, and I'm reading this from the Mario De Gianni's Barnes & Noble Shakespeare, which is a great edition of the Shakespeare. And I'm just going to read what they have. This is on page 94 of this book. It says, Mercutio's account of Queen Mab provides one of the many thematic and imagistic links between Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare's comedy A Midsummer Night's Dream, which we're going to read later this year, in which fairies serve as agents of human sexual desire. Queen Mab generates dreams that correspond to the desire of particular types of people, so that a lawyer, for example, will dream of legal cases, and a soldier of battles. Yet the name Queen Mab itself emphasizes the prominent role dreams play in shaping erotic fantasies, since both Queen and Mab meant a promiscuous woman. All right, and then it continues on to give a little more explicit detail of that. So I think that's a good description of the Mab, all right, and that you have to be careful if the Mab gives you too many dreams, or it'll result in blister plagues. All right, what I think they're really referring to in this instance is like STDs. And the whole thing reeks of extreme sexualness. But I think that's Mercutio's kind of whole deal, that he is overt, that he is over the top. And he makes a great parallel between Mercutio and the nurse in their very bawdy type of language. Act 1, Scene 5 is what everyone's been waiting for. The meeting of Romeo and Juliet. It's what's known as the inciting incident of our story. And so, Capulet welcomes people to the party, all right? And Romeo's walking around, and as soon as he sees Juliet, he says, and this is line 37 and following, or thereabouts, he says, What lady's that which doth enrich the hand of yonder knight? And the serving man says, I know not, sir. And Romeo continues, and this is around like 43 and following, he says, Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheeks of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. And then at the end of his little monologue there, he says, And touching hers, make it bless my rude hand. Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night. So Romeo says in this little scene that he has never seen true beauty. Until he saw, not even he met, he saw Juliet. So he completely forgets about Rosalind. Rosalind? Rosalind who? Alright, we have no idea anymore. She doesn't matter. She's out of the picture. And so the rest of the scene is kind of building up to them meeting. And Tybalt notices Romeo. And he immediately wants to attack. Tybalt notices Romeo. And Capulet's like, hey, buddy, simmer down. If he's not bothering anyone, don't bother him. All right. So, and Tybalt really wants to, like, attack him. He says, I'll not endure him. And Capulet, this is line 74, gets really angry. He says, he shall be endured. All right, you will endure him. You'll have to deal. All right, because if Tybalt makes a notice, all right, then the whole party's about him and not about Juliet. So they meet, Romeo and Juliet, and they meet around line 91, and counting from line 91 all the way to 104, right until their first kiss, all they're meeting is, first Romeo has a quatrain, then Juliet has a quatrain, and then their language alternates. And what occurs is, their first meeting forms a perfect Shakespearean sonnet. And I think that's important, and obviously very deliberate. And you would think the scene would be so romantic. It would be like the most beautiful, amazing scene. And Juliet's response to their first kiss is that he kisses by the book. And by this she means he kisses formally, like he's not a good kisser. And so it's kind of undercut with this humor scene. Yeah. And so they leave, and they're separated, and Juliet says that if he is married, if Romeo is married, and this is line 132 and following, she says, "My grave is like to be my wedding bed." She compares her bed. She basically says, my grave is like my wedding bed. So we see this strong simile. But we also see, so we see a simile, but we also see foreshadowing, because we know Juliet's going to die at the end of our story. All right, the chorus told us that at the very beginning. Plus, it's the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, not the comedy of Romeo and Juliet. And anytime we read a tragedy, all right, we know our story's going to end in death. So, one last thing, I do have to give credit to my beautiful pictures. All of my pictures are copyright of Cambridge Press and Cambridge University. All right, that's where I find all these beautiful pictures. There's a great iPad app called Cambridge Romeo and Juliet. And so I just want to make sure I give them credit for such beautiful pictures. And so ends the first act. All right, so we're moving on to the complication. If you haven't downloaded the notes, please be sure to do that. All right, it's very important that you download those notes and you review. I'm working on an Act 2 review and YouTube video, so I'll be posting that relatively soon. I hope you enjoyed the video, and that's that. Make sure to like and subscribe to my channel.